Welcome, everyone, to another episode of What's Working in E-commerce. I'm your host, Egan Heath from Caravan Digital. We're a direct-to-consumer e-commerce agency. We help with paid search, paid social, and email automation. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Andy Hooper from Global Ecommerce Experts. Andy and his team help clients that are selling in the U.S. sell more in Europe, in the U.K., and even get to 80% of the sales they're doing in the U.S. Abroad. So, Andy, thank you so much for joining today.
No problem. How are you doing?
Good. Remind me again. Tell the audience where you're joining from as well.
Yeah, so I'm joining from a place called Southampton on the south coast of the UK, an hour south of London, which is very close to Mayflower Park, which is where the Mayflower left for you US historians will know exactly what I'm talking about. Our containers and ships that products come into Mayflower Park. So a little bit of history for you as well.
That's a great detail. Thank you for sharing that. So, Andy, I think I'm curious, and the audience is curious about what is the opportunity like for people who are selling in the US? They're curious about selling in the UK, Europe, internationally. Let's just start with why. Why should US sellers think about selling outside the US?
I mean, the first thing is to just look at the stats. So in Europe, there's 550 million people. 28 countries. So you've got the opportunity to sell your product, your brand, to a massive amount of people that are perfectly fit for your products in most cases. So that's the first thing. The numbers of people are there. From the stats and numbers that we have, and we work with over 2,000 brands, what happens is we know that good sellers that we work with, good brands, can get to 80% of the sales they get in the US in Europe. Now, if you look at the numbers, there's 350-ish million in the US, and I said 550 million people. So you'll see that actually there's more people in Europe, but I'm saying you can only get to 80%. Well, the reason for that is that there's 28 countries. So there's 28 languages. So it is slightly more complex, but actually you have the ability to get 80% more sales overnight within reason is actually really, really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe that's a good question too, of what's a realistic time frame to be thinking about? Does this take a year? Does this take a few years? What's a time frame someone should think about to get to that point?
Getting things set up, we typically would work or say to clients that really what you want to think about is what's your launch strategy. So everyone's going to have a slightly different take on this, depending on the resources they have within their business and the skill set they have or their business has. So depending on those things is going to depend on what that looks like. So the setup period, the launch strategy. But let's say, for argument's sake, just to answer the question, you have a perfect launch, a perfect strategy. Times, costs, resources aren't a problem, and it all just happens. If you are and typical brands we would work with are million plus sellers. So if you've got a brand that's doing, let's say a typical seller doing 5 million, right? Our target is to get you to 80% of that. Would probably take between about 2 years, probably between 1.5 and 2.5 years to get you to that level based on everything being, the same SKUs, the same, everything else that goes with that. That's a realistic time frame. We've seen sellers do it quicker than that because they've pumped more cash into it. We've seen sellers do it slower than that because they haven't wanted to reinvest all the profits into it. They've wanted to take money out of the business, which as business owners, we all understand. So there is a ebb and flow of some of these things that, there's no one answer, but to answer the question, 18 months to 2.5 years would be a typical, get you to 80%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And you think about, you're almost doubling your revenue with that. Like that's a great goal. That's a great target. Let's say that, that hypothetical business owner who's doing 5 million a year in the US, they start this process, they're doing it on their own. What sorts of difficulties would they run into that maybe they're not expecting or they're not used to when they're selling in the USA?
Yeah, it's the hurdles that trip you up. So there's lots of different things that, you will be very similar with that trip people up. Customs. Customs anywhere in the world can be a massive pain in the proverbial. So, customs regulations are slightly different. So before you've even got your goods into the country, you need to be aware of the customs and things like that, right? So there's a logistical part to that. There's obviously any e-commerce seller will know that the logistics supply chain can either be your best friend or your worst enemy. And logistics is one thing you need to consider. That's not the biggest thing that trips people up, though. I led you in nicely there, didn't I? So the thing that really trips people up is compliance. So, and there's two sides to compliance. You've got business compliance. How is your business compliant in the region you're selling? And how are your products compliant in the region you're selling? And both of those are the things that trip people up. One, the products are the ones that trip them up illegally, and the business compliance is the one that trips them up with the headache. And they're the two things that really make that happen.
Yeah. Can you tell a story about that or give an example of what sorts of things might come up with, let's say they're not in compliance with either, what does that look like? What happens?
Well, if we take the product compliance first, because that's the first thing that people have to get solved. There's three things you need to consider. One, what regulations does your product fall under? Secondly, is the product compliant with those regulations? And thirdly, what is the label compliant with those regulations? So, great little story, coming back to the point, is that we had a client who was actually shipping through somebody else. They hadn't worked with us previous to this episode, shall we say. They were shipping in, if you can picture, you're walking down the beach right now and it's winter, so I like to pick the beach. You're walking down the beach and you've got a little cart behind you. It's like a little truck. It's got four wheels. It's about ankle height, and you chuck all your stuff in it so you can wheel it to the beach nice and easily, right? Really simple. Little beach buggy cart type thing. Really, really simple product. Sells really, really well across the UK and Europe. So a client had brought that in through customs. But what they had done is they had certification. They'd identified the regulations the product fell under. They got the certification to prove it, and the label was relevant to that match. But on the front picture of the product, the cart had a lap belt with a child sat in it. So what happens is when it goes through customs check the product. Now, technically what the client was trying to sell it as was a beach cart to pull their stuff down to the beach. That's what they were trying to sell it as. No problem. If they were selling it that, the regulations were correct. But unfortunately, the picture on the front, and it was a small picture in the corner, it wasn't the main picture, but a small picture in the corner, had a child sat in it with a belt going across. And the problem with that is that as soon as it's got a belt going across, it becomes a buggy or a pushchair. Is that what you call it in the States? It's a buggy.
We might say a stroller. Yep.
Yeah. So it becomes a stroller. And of course, the regulations for a stroller are very different to the regulations for a cart. So that's the sort of thing that really trips people up. They haven't identified properly the regulations the product falls under. And it gets caught up at customs or on a marketplace, in a warehouse or something along those lines.
Yeah. I think when you're saying cart, we might say wagon or something like that in the US where, yep. Okay. Got it. That's a great example. And I think my understanding broadly, and this might be worth talking about, just kind of cultural and governmental differences, US to, EU and UK, is in the US, it's up to the consumer to prove something was unsafe or there was a problem. Like we've seen that with, toys and pillows and all kinds of issues in the US on product safety. I think in Europe, the regime is a little different. It's sort of like you need to prove it before you sell it rather than once there's a problem. Is that a fair way to summarize that?
Yeah, exactly that. Most of the products coming in, anything that might be slightly dangerous, right? So it could be an electrical product, could be a child's toy. It could be a supplement. It could be a cosmetic, right? Everything needs to be proven that the product, before it goes on the market, has to be safe. So there has to be testing done. There has to be certificates to make sure it's compliant. And some of those things are relatively straightforward to do. When you're talking about, an electrical product, most manufacturers can do that for you, right? So you don't need to overcomplicate it. There are things that are more complicated, like cosmetics, medical products. Things like supplements are relatively easy. But you do need to, exactly that, you need to prove to the market before it goes on the market that it's compliant with the regulations to be sold.
And you said there was another kind of compliance. So there's kind of product compliance, then business level compliance. What does that look like? What does that mean? And what happens, say, when you don't have that? So
business clients, the easiest way to talk about business compliance, sorry, is tax. The bottom line is, wherever you are in the world, if you sell products in that region, the government that you're selling it to wants a little thank you, and they call that tax. That's how governments make their money. Now, it doesn't matter where in the world, you're going to have to pay tax. And Europe is no different. And in Europe, it's called VAT, value added tax. It's essentially the same thing as sales tax. It's applied slightly different. But if you can imagine Nexus in the US, you've got 50 odd states doing it in 50 different ways. In Europe, you've got 28 countries doing it in 28 slightly different ways. It's the same as we're all saying we're doing it the same way, but we've all got our slightly different tweaks and adaptations to the rules and regulations.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think e-commerce sellers in the US are used to that. A couple of years ago, we had a US Supreme Court ruling called Wayfair. It was specifically about that issue of if you're doing a certain amount of sales per state, suddenly you're liable for sales tax in that state. So that's a very helpful way for us to think about it as Americans, of think of these different European countries almost like different states with different, tax and regulatory regimes, right?
And it's exactly the same in Europe. It's no different. The government wants a thank you for you selling the products in that region. It's a tax. No one wants to pay tax. No one likes paying tax. But the bottom line is we've all got to do it. So that's the business compliance. Now, off the business compliance, the tax is one piece. There's a whole load of other little bits that you need to consider on how you set the company up. Is it VAT registered? Do you have to set up an entity? Do you need an authorized representative, a responsible person in region for selling your products? Slightly comes under product compliance. And of course, in this day and age, we also now get recycling tax. So you need to think about recycling tax as well as a key component of your tax strategy, should we say.
I've not heard of that before. I assume that's hey, this product's going to cost something to recycle on the back end and you pay that tax in the front end. Is that how that works?
In a nutshell, yes.
Wow. Yeah, we do not have that in the US, and maybe we should. That's pretty interesting. Okay, I want to ask you about kind of languages and culture and internationalization. Is it a good time to turn to that, or are there more pieces about this regulation we should talk about first?
Nope. I think no one likes hearing about the compliance. They just like hearing about the fun stuff. How do we translate our products to make them sell?
Yeah, how do we make the money, right? There's a couple things before we get from A to B on that, right? So that makes sense. Okay, I think again, the analogy or the comparison of think about U.S. states, think about European countries, that's really helpful for Americans because they're maybe less familiar with the EU. One of the big differences in the U.S., for the most part, people are thinking in English. They might be doing some things in Spanish, but in general, I think people are just thinking, okay, we're selling in the U.S. states, everything's going to be in English. How does that work with different languages in the EU and across the UK, and just like once someone is selling in other countries and other cultures and languages like that, what do they need to think about? What does that look like on Amazon? What does that look like on their website and ads? Talk us through that.
Different marketplaces, platforms, you need to have a slightly different strategy in different ways. Now, every country does have a slightly different culture. They all need different languages. We've already discussed that. So you need to make sure that when you're selling the product to someone in that, whether it be Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and the list goes on, that it's relevant to that market. Now, the first thing to say is when you launch, part of your launch strategy shouldn't be to try and launch in 28 countries all at once. And the reason for that is, one, you'll just go out of business. You just won't be able to supply that many products to that many countries and understand those countries in that depth. You have a launch strategy where you start building out each country step by step. Typically, most of our clients start with the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. The reason for that is that corners most of the market for most marketplaces. So, for example, on Amazon, Germany and the UK accounts for 2/3 of all sales across Europe. So let's just take Germany as an example here about how you would do that. There's 3 steps to translations, right? When you first launch, the first thing to do is to just translate everything by Google Translate or something similar. Take a free translation tool that you can put on all of your listings and do that for the keywords as well, just to get something up and happening and running. All right. So that's the first thing to say. Now, we can all identify, we've all been on a listing at some point, and this is the same for your website as well. Sorry, this is exactly the same strategy for if you're on a Shopify store or something like that, right? You basically then utilize the sort of keywords that are coming from the traffic. So on Amazon, it might be using Amazon ads. For Shopify, it might be Google ads. You're then utilizing the resources around you to identify the keywords that are coming out of those countries. At that point, you then pay for a proper translation, a native tongue translation. There's no point putting money behind a SKU that hasn't launched yet for hundreds and hundreds of pounds to do all the translations when the keywords are going to change in a week's time. There's just 0 point. And it's about how you do that. So you take the free option first. You put things online. You might spend a small amount of money doing a native tongue translation, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to look at that listing and think that definitely doesn't read right, because we've all seen those.
Yeah, I think in the US, we're sort of used to maybe funny signs or funny products that were translated from maybe Chinese or something, and just it reads idiosyncratically in English, and so that's kind of what you're saying. You might do that in German if you're not careful, right?
Exactly that. So the first step is to do a quick to get it live is to do a quick translation. Okay, do that for the keywords, get it into the thing, because in a week's time you're going to change it anyway, right? In fact, it might even be a week before you change it. It depends on the volume of your SKU, right?
Are you saying you're going to change it because you're going to go to that next level and hire a professional translator? Is that why you're going to change it?
No, because what you're doing is you're identifying. Let's take Amazon as a great example. You're going to turn automatic ads on straight away, because everyone puts on automatic ads and then uses the automatic ad to find and develop the keywords going forwards. So it's exactly the same in Germany. You can turn the automatic ad on and then start using the keywords that are coming out of the ads that you're developing for the keywords for that product. Once you start seeing sales, you then do a full native tongue translation. Okay. A full native tongue translation for a SKU is going to be anywhere between 50 and £100, give or take, right? So you're going to get that translation done. That's why you want to just wait a moment before you do it. So you wait, you then do that. Once that product has started selling a decent volume and you're managing to edge out the keywords, and the time you're changing the listing is lengthening, at that point you can get a full sales and marketing copy sort of translation that's probably going to cost you 2 or 3 times as much. But it's really important to make sure, one, you do the translation. But secondly, you've got to think about the photos of the product. So on the photos, what do you need to do on the photos to make sure they look and resemble or look like they've been taken in that country? Because if you take the photo, let's take bathroom products, right? You take the bathroom products in a bathroom in the US. You've got a nice hero image. You've got a lifestyle photo. Wonderful. But it's of an American bathroom, WC, right? That's where it is. Actually, they look different in Europe. In fact, they look different in most parts of Europe. So it's also about resembling the marketplace.
This is fascinating. So it's not just the language that needs to be translated, it's the imagery as well needs to be localized.
It needs to fit with the culture. And that might not be something you do overnight. It might be that actually what you do is you move your hero and lifestyle images to the end and move your videos and product photos to the beginning, where you might not do that on some stores. You might, because the first 3 images they look at might just be, with a white background in 3 different rotations or whatever it might be. Then have the hero, because you don't have to do these on day one. What you don't want to do is spend thousands and thousands and thousands on more photographs when actually, you haven't proven that SKU works yet. You can build up to that.
Sure, pretty fascinating. I'm kind of hung up on the language part of it, or I'm just curious about it. And I think people might ask, hey, in the age of Chat GPT, can we get an AI translation for that next level, or are we still reliant on human translators to get the subtleties right?
Do you know what? I downloaded, Chat GPT is literally we're in mid-January. So just for reference, so I downloaded it a week ago and started utilizing it. I've not done a translation on it yet, but you've just prompted me to go away and try that in about 5 minutes after we've done this, because it would save our sellers. We would just tell sellers, hey, you want to do your translations, do it here. I mean, it would be epic. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, that would be wicked, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it sounds like in your experience to date, pre-Chat GPT at least, Google Translate maybe gets you 80, 90% of the way there, but for that last 10%, you really need a professional to get the details right. Has that been your experience?
100%. Because we've all seen the listings, as we alluded to, where someone's done the translate and it just doesn't quite read right.
Sounds good. I'm a digital marketing agency owner, so I don't get into the operational side. I think you guys do a little more. Is there a fulfillment by Amazon option in the EU and the UK? Are people doing 3PLs? Like, what does that look like in terms of warehousing and shipping, the products out?
So when typically smaller sellers all go straight to FBA. There is FBA across Europe that can be totally utilized, and that will fulfill across Europe. No problem at all. As sellers in the States know, that whilst FBA is a great option and you should utilize it, it comes with its own risks and problems. So most of our clients have a strategy of utilize a 3PL, fulfill into Amazon, but also sell on other channels, omni-channel, to sell via eBay or their own website through a 3PL as well. Because the problem you've got is when you've got stock in another European country, you need it in both the UK and Europe. So you need stock in both. And if stock runs out, as we all know, stock runs out, all of a sudden your SKUs start diving and your rankings go. So making sure you've got stock locally that can fill up is really, really important, number one. And obviously, if you've got stock in a warehouse locally, 3PL locally, then actually my answer is you're losing money, because what happens is they put it in a warehouse, and we've got clients like this in our warehouses where the stock comes in and it's, okay, I only sell on Amazon. No problem at all. So it goes to Amazon, drip feed into Amazon. But actually, if they just connected to eBay or OnBuy or CD Discount or one of the other probably 50 solid marketplaces in Europe, okay, UK and Europe, then actually you'd probably find that stock would deplete in twice the speed. So they won't have the same volume they get on Amazon. Of course they won't. But what they will have is they'll be reducing their storage fees every single day. So they're not only just getting the money in, and we all know that with e-commerce sellers, you've got stock which is costing you. And the quicker you can sell that, the quicker you can reinvest that stock and get that into more stock. So if you've got the opportunity with a 3PL to sell on other channels, that's the key thing to do.
That's interesting. In the US, maybe the equivalent would be, people get on Amazon, maybe they look into Walmart, maybe they're doing some target.com sort of stuff. It sounds like there's equivalence in, Europe that can help you move product faster. Is that right?
100%. You've got to think about, we are here to successfully expand e-commerce brands into Europe. We have a full omni-channel approach, and the only way you are successful in Europe is by looking at all the other channels. Amazon will get you so far if you sell on Amazon, but it won't get you the rest of the way. You've got to look at all the opportunities that are available to you to get you to that next step.
Well, Andy, I know there's a lot to this. There's a lot of complexities. I'm just imagining an e-commerce seller who's going like this in their chin, thinking about it, imagining how complicated this would be, what the learning curve is like if they did it themselves. Maybe talk a bit about your company, who's a good fit for you, and where can people find you if they'd like to have a conversation about this?
Wonderful. Yeah. So our company is Global Ecommerce Experts. We successfully expand e-commerce brands into Europe. Now, if you've liked what you heard, we've got a podcast. You can go into our podcast, which is E-commerce Expander Secrets. And on that podcast, we pretty much tell you everything you need to know on how to do it to expand your brand. 100%. All of the content, we have a YouTube channel that also has all the content, Global Ecommerce Experts. All of that content is available for you online. We talk about how you can do it. We have a 7-step success pathway that can talk you through how to successfully expand. We've got a book on it. We've got an ebook on it. We've got everything you need is out there and available to you. So if you want to learn how to do it and you've got the time to do it, then go and take all of that information, learn it, digest it, and then you'll be able to work out how to successfully expand your brand to Europe. 100%. If you want to fast track that process, number one, you can go to our website to download our 7-step guide. So if you Google Global Ecommerce Experts, which is global-commerceexperts.com/podcast, you'll be able to download our 7-step guide. There's no malware behind that. You haven't got to put your email address in or anything like that. There's no lead magnet, because we believe that what we do is so epic, you'll want to come and talk to us about doing it anyway, hopefully. Once you've read that and you wanted someone to help and support you with that, you can reach out to us. Obviously, you can come to the same website. My name's Andy Hooper. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the EU e-commerce guy, go-to guy, whatever you want to call it. Everyone comes to me for the advice, consultancy, and tips, because we've served over 2,000 clients to successfully expand into Europe. So we know all the intricacies about how to do it. You can reach out on all the usual social channels, or get in contact with me via LinkedIn, and we'd love to have a conversation about how we can successfully expand you.
Love it. Well, Andy Hooper, thanks for coming on and sharing what's working in e-commerce.
No problem. Thanks for having us.